Hey there. Before we begin tonight, take a moment, dim the lights, maybe put on a blanket. Let the cold creep in just a little, because we're going back. Not decades, not centuries, but to a time when winter didn't just bite at your nose. It broke your bones. It starved your family. It dragged gods down from heaven and made them beg for warmth. Tonight, we step into the long-forgotten dark, a world without central heating, without supermarkets, without mercy. This is how people survived winter in the medieval world. And if you think you could handle it, you probably wouldn't last a week. Because back then, when the snow came early and the sun left the sky, they didn't just fear wolves. They feared the silence more. The cold was not romantic. It was not sleigh bells and scarves and hot cider. It was something that hunted you, a creeping, silent enemy that came every year with perfect precision, and stayed longer than it was welcome, filled your lungs, killed your crops, turned your fingers black and your thoughts cruel. It wasn't just the snow. It was what the snow stole: your warmth, your strength, your sanity, and most terrifying of all, it was expected. For the people of the medieval world, especially in Europe and the North, winter was not a season. It was a sentence. They had no calendars. They knew the cold by what it took. The hunger moon, the starving time, deep snow, the days of hollow eyes. They marked the frost not by its arrival, but by how long the screams in the woods lasted. You see, when the sun disappeared behind gray skies for weeks, sometimes months, the line between the living and the dead blurred. Not just outside, but inside the home. Fathers went to chop wood and never returned. Children were buried in root cellars to keep the wolves away. Entire villages were swallowed by blizzards, their names forgotten, except in the mutterings of old women around the hearth. And even if the wolves didn't come, even if raiders didn't break through your brittle door, even if you had firewood and pickled vegetables and salted pork, there was still the silence. That oppressive, muffled quiet. No birds, no bells, no voices, just wind and breath and thoughts that started to rot. So let me ask you something. Was it the cold that killed them? Or was it the hunger, the desperation, the slow madness of knowing the sun would not rise before your hope died first? Modern people worry about cold too, but we worry in different ways. Will the heating bill be too high? Will the blackout last longer than an hour? Will the roads freeze over before our groceries arrive? But imagine a world where there is no bill, because there is no fire, no road, because the snow has devoured the landscape, no grocery store, because the only food left is what you buried months ago. Praying mice wouldn't find it first. This isn't some apocalypse fantasy. This was every winter for hundreds of years. And somehow, they endured, through cracked skin and blackened toes, through nights that stretched longer than your strength could handle. They endured, not because they were strong, not because they were brave, but because there was no other choice. The cold didn't care how much you cried. It just waited to see which of you would break first, your fire or your faith. So tonight, as you sip something warm, as you listen from your soft room with humming walls and closed windows, remember them, the people who dug their nails into the dirt to stay warm, who chewed roots like meat, who feared the dark not because it was empty, but because it wasn't. And if you've ever felt the weight of winter press on your chest, if you've ever stared at the snow and felt unease rather than joy, maybe some small part of you still remembers this world. A world where the wolves weren't outside, they were inside. So, how did they survive? What did they burn? What did they eat? What did they believe to keep from going mad? Because surviving the cold isn't about fire. It's about what you do when the fire runs out. And that's what we're going to uncover piece by piece. But be warned, this journey won't be gentle, because the people we're about to meet weren't trying to live well, they were just trying to live long enough. So before we step into the first frost, ask yourself this: could you do what they did? Could you bury your child to keep the wind from eating them? Could you light your last candle, knowing it would show raiders where to find you? Could you kill your neighbor For a turnip? Because to understand how they survived, first you have to understand what they were surviving. Chapter 1. The Winter That Never Forgave. Winter didn't begin with snowfall. It began with silence. The birds stopped singing. The rivers slowed. The colors bled from the world until only gray remained. People didn't watch the weather, they watched the animals. When the cattle began to shiver in their own breath and the wolves came closer to the treeline, the villagers knew the long sleep was near. But this wasn't just winter. This was the reckoning. Because in the medieval world, winter wasn't seen as a time of rest or even a cruel inconvenience. It was war. Slow, creeping siege that took everything you had and still asked for more. You couldn't reason with it. You couldn't outsmart it. The best you could do was not die. And even that was never promised. It's easy to romanticize the past. The crackle of a hearth, thick woolen cloaks, the crunch of snow underfoot. But reality rarely matched poetry. For the peasants of medieval Europe, especially in the north, winter was an annual purge, a culling of the weak, the unlucky, and sometimes even the innocent. The records that survive speak of famine, of frostbitten limbs rotting in barns, of entire villages that froze into statues, and were found months later, quiet, stiff, and oddly peaceful. But long before flesh gave out, the mind began to crack. Because more than the cold, more than the hunger, it was the waiting that killed you. Waiting for the sun to return. Waiting for the screams to stop. Waiting for the ice to melt so you could finally bury the dead, or forget them. The winters of the medieval period were not always equal in their cruelty. Some years were manageable. Others were hell. Historians speak of a period called the Little Ice Age, stretching roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries, with roots even earlier in the High Middle Ages. It brought longer, harsher winters to much of Europe, and though we still debate the exact timing, the lived experience is undeniable. Harvests failed, rivers froze, famines struck with increasing frequency. Imagine standing in a one-room hut with your entire family, your animals, your smoke-blackened rafters, and only 3 salted fish to stretch across the next 4 months. Outside, snow smothers the land. There's no wood left. Your neighbor hasn't been seen in days. And in the distance, something howls. This was not survival in the modern sense. This was the kind of existence where you stared at a frozen turnip and tried to figure out whether to eat it or trade it for a handful of straw to burn. And still, it got colder. Winter blurred the line between folklore and reality. In the deepest nights, it was impossible to tell whether the creaking beyond the wall was just snow sliding off the roof, or something older, something watching. Villagers whispered of spirits that rode the wind, the wild hunt, the black dog, Frau Perkta, Krampus, and, worse, figures that moved between dream and waking. Demons didn't need fire. They were drawn to breath, to warmth, to the soft pulse of something still alive. There were stories of villagers who wandered into the woods to relieve themselves and never returned. The next spring, they were found buried in snowdrifts, mouths frozen open, arms stretched toward the village. The snow, people said, could hear you, and when it was deep enough, it answered. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval winter wasn't what came from without, but what came from within. As days grew shorter and nights longer, families huddled together in unventilated spaces, with little light and no privacy. Weeks could pass without sunlight, and in the dark, the mind plays tricks. Whispers in the rafters, eyes in the wood grain, shadows that moved when no one did. They had no word for seasonal depression, but they knew its weight. They called it the hollow time, or the dead days, a stretch between December and February when nothing grew, nothing moved, and nothing sang. People became lethargic, quick-tempered, silent, sometimes violent. Brother would lash out and not know why. A mother would cry for hours, then forget she ever had a reason. Children would stare into the fire as if something stared back. Some blamed spirits, others blamed God, but most just blamed the cold. It didn't just steal warmth. It hollowed people out. Modern fears may seem different, but they're not. We speak of energy collapse, of fuel shortages, of blackouts during snowstorms. We worry whether our systems can handle the next polar vortex. We hoard batteries, gas, and dry goods like medieval villagers hoarded onions and salt. We're not afraid of winter. We're afraid of being medieval again. Because in a world where technology flickers, the cold is no longer quaint. It's lethal, and it returns every year. Back then, the only backup generator was God. And when prayers failed, there were no answers. But even beyond the frost and famine, winter held spiritual dread. This was the time when churches filled with people begging for mercy, not from the cold, but from what the cold revealed. In many Christian calendars, the weeks following Christmas were marked by Epiphany, the appearance of light in a dark world. But in local traditions, especially in rural Germany, Scandinavia, and Slavic regions, these were the 12 nights, the days when the veil between worlds thinned and things walked freely. People nailed herbs to doors, burned juniper, whispered Latin they barely understood. And still, people disappeared. Sometimes they came back different, sometimes not at all. The Norse called it Fimbulwinter, the great winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. According to legend, it would last 3 full years with no summer between. Prophecy? A myth? Or just a memory? Because in certain years, winter really did feel endless. In 1315, Europe was struck by one of the worst famines in its history. Continuous rains and cold destroyed crops for 3 years straight. Grain rotted, livestock starved, parents abandoned their children. Cannibalism was whispered, and when the food finally came back, something in the soul didn't. Even now, when the wind howls through certain valleys, old folks say it sounds like the hungry years. You don't forget a winter like that. Even if you weren't there, your bones remember, but the question still burns. How did they survive? Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally? How do you go to sleep at night knowing there's no more bread? That your neighbor's barn smells like smoke and meat, but no one saw a slaughter? How do you keep your children warm when the fire's gone out, and all that's left are the dying embers of your hope? They had no manuals, no helplines, no rescue, just instinct, ritual, desperation, and the wisdom of generations passed in whispers over a dying flame. And yet, they endured. Not all, not easily, not well, but enough. Enough to light the next fire, to hold on to one more night, to tell stories we still remember. Because survival wasn't about glory. It was about making it until spring. But even spring wasn't promised. Not in their world. Survival in medieval winter didn't begin with fire or food. It began with fear, and how that fear was explained. In a world without science or central heat, stories became survival maps. Myths were warnings. Folk tales were instructions. People learned from what had not yet killed them. And in winter, everything felt like it was trying to. In the darkest corners of Europe, winter became its own religion, fierce, punishing, and ritual-bound. Every culture had their own rules for enduring it. Not physical rules, spiritual ones. Guidelines whispered in. Frostbitten corners. Never leave offerings uncovered. Never whistle after dark. Never sweep your home during a blizzard. Why? Because doing so might call forth what they feared most. The invisible things that walked when the world fell silent. In the Highlands of Scotland, people spoke of the Cailleach Burr, a storm hag who froze the land each year with her staff. In Eastern Europe, it was Morozko, the frost spirit who rewarded obedience but froze the insolent. Germans feared Perchta, who would slit the bellies of disobedient children and stuff them with straw. And always wolves circled the edge of the imagination. Not just the real ones, whose eyes glowed in the forest edge, but the other kind, skinwalkers, shapeshifters, and the restless souls of the unburied dead. To the medieval mind, snow didn't just conceal things, set them free. The Catholic Church tried to ban these beliefs, but winter had a way of ignoring doctrine. People didn't pray to saints. When the chimney screamed, they prayed to the old things. They burned herbs. They tied red thread around door handles. They sacrificed animals not in secret but together, quietly, as if the wind might listen. The dark midwinter rites, as they were sometimes called by scribes, were a holdover from pagan times. In some places, families left bread and lard out for spirits. In others, they tossed bits of fur or ash into the snow to mark their blood. There are accounts of entire villages engaging in group rituals to call back the sun, chanting through the blackest nights, not because they expected success, but because the alternative was unbearable. That winter would not end, because sometimes it didn't. Imagine what it felt like to survive one brutal winter, only to realize spring brought no green, no bloom, no birds, another frost, another empty storehouse, another friend gone missing. Some winters were so severe that time itself seemed to bend. People forgot which month it was. They stopped, marking the calendar. A strange timelessness took hold, where it felt like the world had simply stopped trying. In these moments, reality blurred, and the madness crept in. There are scattered but terrifying accounts of sleeping madness. Whole households going mute, people staring for days at blank walls, families refusing to speak, eat, or leave their beds, convinced they were already dead. Monks documented what they called mortis anime, the death of the soul. One such record from a northern abbey describes a family found in their home, alive but unmoving, surrounded by frost-covered bread they had not touched. When asked why they had not eaten, the mother simply said, "The sun has died. We are buried with it." Another report tells of a village that dug a communal hole in the snow and climbed in 40 people, hoping the earth would warm them. They were found days later, many dead, the rest frostbitten beyond healing. One survivor muttered over and over, "No winter, no winter, no winter." What you begin to realize is that cold didn't just kill the body, it unstitched the world. And yet, despite all this, people still clung to hope, not because it was rational, but because it was all they had left. They made charms, sun discs, pine cones painted with ochre, effigies of warmth. Children were taught to sing to the sky to welcome back the light. Some slept with rocks warmed by fire and carved with prayers. They believed in signs. A crow flying east might mean a shorter winter. A sudden wind could mark a coming thaw. Dream of green hills could be a message from a dead ancestor. The human mind is a fortress. Even buried in snow, it fights for something to believe in. Of course, not all winters were catastrophes. Some were just cruel in small ways. A cold that wouldn't let a fire catch. A horse that froze overnight, its breath turned to crystal. A door that iced shut with a baby still outside. Small failures that added up, each one a chisel against the stone of the soul. And then came the real fear that this would be the one. The winter that didn't end. The one where the sun stayed gone. In some regions, there were even old warnings passed down. If the snow stays past the third moon, the earth has turned its back. It was half ritual, half weather lore, and all despair. We often forget this now, but medieval people didn't see the seasons as reliable. They were contingent, conditional, earned, not promised. And so they prepared, in ways that were practical, and in ways that were primal. Not just firewood and root vegetables, but ritual, belief, community, silence. They survived winter not just by fighting it, but by surrendering to it, accepting its hunger, respecting its cruelty, learning its patterns and praying, often hopelessly, to outlast it. Because in the end, that's all winter demanded. Not submission, not conquest, just that you lived through it. And many didn't. By the time the thaw came, if it came, it brought no joy, only exhaustion, only relief that the test was over. Families emerged like ghosts from their homes, pale, hollow-eyed, thinner, fewer. They didn't run outside. They didn't sing. They waited to see if it was real, to see if this time they had truly made it. And that brings us to the real question. They didn't have thermostats. They didn't have heaters or electric blankets or hot showers. They didn't even have enough wood most of the time. So, how did they survive the cold itself? Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally day after day in homes built of mud and straw. What did they burn when the wood was gone? What tricks did they use to trap heat, to stay dry, to live? And what role did faith, real or imagined, play in keeping the fire of the human spirit alive? That's what we're about to uncover. Because for them, warmth wasn't comfort. It was salvation, and it was earned every single night in smoke, sweat, and sacrifice. Chapter 2: Firewood, Fat, and Faith. Surviving the cold. Surviving winter in the medieval world wasn't just about outlasting the cold. It was about mastering every material and moment the cold didn't control. Every item in your home was a weapon in your private war against the ice, and every mistake was deadly. It began in autumn, because if you waited for the snow to fall, it was already too late. Villagers in northern Europe and even temperate zones spent all of summer and early fall preparing for winter. That didn't mean sipping wine while hanging herbs on wooden rafters. It meant working until your hands bled. It meant hauling logs, drying meat, thatching roofs, pickling what you could, slaughtering animals, and burying what you couldn't eat. Firewood wasn't something you bought. It was something you bled for. A healthy household needed enough dry wood to last at least 3 months. Not green wood, it had to be seasoned and stored in a way that it wouldn't get wet again. A single misstep, leaving it uncovered, storing it too close to damp walls, waiting too long, and all that effort would turn to rot. Or worse, ice. In Iceland and Scandinavia, where trees were scarce, they burned peat. In places without peat, they used dried dung, straw, bones, anything that would catch fire without suffocating them in smoke. Because that was another danger: ventilation. People often forget medieval homes weren't built to be cozy. They were built to trap heat. That meant few windows, no chimneys in the early periods, and thick, low ceilings. Good for warmth, deadly for smoke. Fire could warm you, could also choke you to death in your sleep. And then there was fat. Fat wasn't just for food, it was heat. Tallow candles were made by boiling animal fat, straining it, and dipping bits of string repeatedly until a thick layer formed. These candles gave off a weak, flickering light and an unmistakable greasy scent. But they burned, and that's what mattered. Fat was also smeared along doors and windows as a makeshift sealant. Pig fat, in particular, could be rendered into a sticky, greasy paste that hardened in the cold and helped block out drafts. It wasn't perfect, but perfection wasn't the goal. Survival was. In the absence of modern insulation, people used everything. Moss between logs, straw in the rafters, wool stuffed into cracks. Walls were packed with layers of mud and dung. In colder climates, they even banked snow against the outside of their homes because the packed snow, ironically, acted as insulation, locking heat inside and cutting wind. The very structure of a medieval home reflected the need to survive. In peasant cottages across England, France, and Central Europe, the design was simple but efficient. Low ceilings, one main room, sometimes with a dirt floor, and a central fire. The fire pit had no chimney. Smoke filled the room and slowly drifted out through a hole in the roof. It wasn't elegant, but the smoky air helped dry meat, kill fleas, and warm the bones. Families lived with their animals, not beside them, with them. Chickens, pigs, goats, even the occasional calf, all slept inside. Their warmth wasn't just tolerated, it was welcome. A cow could heat a room better than a second log. Beds were shared. A whole family might sleep under a single fur, pressed together, breath mingling, limbs knotted. There was no modesty, there was no privacy, just warmth. That was intimacy in its most elemental form. And yet, fire was never trusted. People feared it, revered it, worshipped it. In many regions, fire was seen as a sacred boundary, the only thing keeping the dark world at bay. Letting a fire go out wasn't just foolish, it was an invitation to ruin. In Ireland and parts of rural Scandinavia, There were strict rules about tending the hearth. The fire was often kept alive for months without extinguishing, carefully fed each night with the right wood, ashes banked, embers preserved. If it died accidentally, it was bad luck. If it died on purpose, it was blasphemy. In some households, it was believed that the hearth had a spirit, something older than God, who watched over the family. The fire was given offerings. A splash of ale, a bit of meat, even a whispered story. Children were taught to speak kindly near the flames, never insult them, never spit into them. Fire had memory. In Russia, the domovoi was said to live near the hearth, a protective household spirit. In Lithuania, they called it Gabija, the fire goddess. And in Slavic villages, a young woman might tend the fire in silence as part of a coming-of-age ritual. Her role was sacred. Her mistake, if she made one, could bring illness or worse, because fire wasn't just heat, it was presence, a living thing that needed feeding, watching, respect. And when you were surrounded by snow, wind, and screams carried by ice, it was also the only proof that you were alive. Which brings us to a haunting idea. What happens when fire disappears? Let's jump forward, just for a moment. Imagine this same world. Without fire. It's not hard. The wood is wet. The flint is lost. The fat is gone. You've burned your last stool leg 2 nights ago. Your breath fogs in front of you. The walls are coated in frost. You wrap yourself in rags and try to hold your children, but you're all shaking. Not from fear, not even from cold, from loss. Because when the fire goes out, it's not just heat that leaves. It's hope. And this isn't ancient drama. This is what people lived with, expected even every year. They knew families who died by freezing. They heard the tales of the sleeping madness. They found blackened limbs, blue skin, burned out homes. Sometimes fire killed you, but it was still the only thing that kept the dark at bay. In fact, the fire wasn't just the center of the home. It was the center of the world. Everything revolved around it. Meals, stories, prayers. Children learned to crawl by circling it. Couples whispered to each other on its edge. The sick were brought close to it, as though flame might burn out illness. The dying were laid beside it to pass with warmth on their skin. And when people spoke of spring returning, they didn't talk about flowers or birds or trees. They said, "We'll need less wood." They said, "The fire won't have to fight so hard." But even the best prepared families sometimes lost that fight. Because fire wasn't free. Wood runs out, fat spoils, straw molds, roofs leak. And if the wrong storm hits, or a fire pit collapses, or a careless spark turns your food stores to ash, you're done. You'll freeze. Not in some dramatic collapse either, but slowly, one breath at a time, until you don't shiver anymore. And then someone finds you in the spring, curled like a child, hands wrapped around nothing. Because fire is life, and life is fragile. Once the fire was lit, the game had just begun. The medieval household became a kind of living furnace. Everything in it, every plank of wood, every breath of air existed for one reason: to hold the cold at bay. The home was not just shelter. It was a fragile womb, and it needed tending like a newborn. Let's talk about walls. Thick ones meant better insulation, but thickness wasn't everything. In timber regions, walls were constructed with wattle and daub, woven branches coated in a slurry of clay, straw, and manure. It was messy, crude, and surprisingly effective. The manure added insulation and held moisture out when it didn't freeze solid and crack. In stone-heavy areas like Scotland or parts of France, stone walls held heat poorly, but they lasted. These homes, compensated with animal skins, hung from ceilings and thick tapestries nailed to walls to trap heat. If you were wealthy, you had rugs on the floors, on the walls, and sometimes the ceilings too. Roofs were thatched. If done correctly, snow sat on them like frosting, good insulation. If done poorly, the roof collapsed under its own weight, often at night, and sometimes while people slept. Drafts were everywhere, but villagers had tricks: straw-packed floorboards, dried moss in wall crevices, bundles of reeds tied and nailed into corners. Nothing was wasted. Even ash was used, sprinkled into the dirt floors to reduce dampness and rot. The beds, if they existed, were not what you're imagining. You didn't climb into a medieval bed. You climbed under it. Box beds were common in parts of the north, essentially wooden cabinets with doors or curtains to trap body heat. A family of 4 might sleep in one together. No pillows, just straw. Blankets were rare. More often, cloaks, animal hides, and rag-stitched patchwork were layered for warmth. The poorest slept in their clothes, sometimes in all the clothes they owned, under piles of hay and the shared breath of others. But fire still mattered. Every few hours, someone had to stoke it. There was no sleeping through the night. The fire watcher role often rotated, especially among older children. Fall asleep on your shift and you could wake to a freezing home, or worse, no home at all. A single moment of laziness, and the whole household might pay with their lives. Then came food, or the lack of it. By midwinter, fresh bread was a fantasy. Root vegetables, salted meats, pickled cabbage, these were your lifelines. Cabbage soup, onion broth, porridge made from acorn flour or ground peas. Protein came from lard, broth, or occasionally dried meat. But even fat was rationed. In some places, they greased lips with tallow, not to eat it, but to trick the body into thinking it had been fed. Children chewed boiled leather. Adults gnawed on bones just to fool the stomach. A family might eat the same cold stew for 3 weeks, just adding water each day and a few pinches of barley. And every meal was eaten beside the fire, because even food lost its strength in the cold. Community was another defense. In the harshest parts of winter, isolation could kill. So people, especially the poor, sought each other out. Neighbors shared hearths. 5 families might cram into a single longhouse. Crowded? Yes, but warmer and safer. The danger, of course, was illness. One sick child and the entire house could fall. But that was a risk most were willing to take. There are records of villages establishing fire circles, rotating homes where larger groups gathered to sleep, eat, and work by firelight. These weren't parties. They were lifelines. Old women told stories. Men repaired tools. Children boiled snow for water. No one sat still, because stillness was an invitation to death. And then, there was faith. In this world, prayer wasn't a luxury. It was as essential as wood. People believed not just in God, but in the need for God. You didn't survive the dark without asking something for mercy, without bargaining. The hearth became an altar. People made crosses from reeds. They scrawled verses in soot above the door. They blessed their food, their beds, their firewood. Every cough, every creak of the walls, every flicker of light was a potential omen. Superstition wasn't weakness. It was structure. When logic failed, ritual stepped in. Some families lit candles on specific days, feast days of saints who were thought to protect against cold, hunger, or madness. Saint Bridget in Ireland, Saint Blaise in parts of France. In Russia, Saint Nicholas was invoked not just for generosity, but for warmth. Prayers weren't always spoken aloud. Sometimes they were hummed into the dark, sung into boiling water, whispered into frozen hands. And when someone died, their body was kept near the fire as long as possible. To keep the soul warm, they said, to help it rise. But even with preparation, even with faith, not everyone made it. And this led to the cruelest lesson of all. You could do everything right and still lose. Your fire could be steady, your home sealed, your food rationed. And still, the snow could come earlier than expected. The frost could crack your root cellar. Your neighbor could steal your wood, or worse, beg for it. Because nothing is more dangerous than a desperate man with freezing children. By late February, desperation reached its peak. They called it the starving month. It was when the storehouses echoed, when firewood was sticks and straw, when the animals were skin and bone, and too precious to eat, when people looked at their neighbors and thought terrible thoughts. There are reports, quiet, buried, half-censored, of crimes committed for food, of homes raided for a single potato, of fathers who fled in shame, unable to watch their families die, of children who froze just steps from shelter, unable to push the door open, and still, most endured. Why? Because endurance wasn't heroic. It was ordinary. It was in every splinter, every ash pile, every whisper of thanks at dawn. And that's what makes medieval winter survival so strange to modern ears. They didn't expect comfort. They didn't dream of escape. They didn't prepare because they were afraid. They prepared because it was what you did. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It was hard, boring, painful, repetitive, but it worked, most years. So when we imagine a medieval winter, don't imagine a snow globe. Don't imagine nights sipping mulled wine. Imagine cracked lips. Imagine chapped hands dunking cold cloth into boiling water. Imagine a woman waking up 5 times a night to stir the fire, praying the smoke doesn't blind the baby. Imagine hunger as a house guest, and death as the neighbor who might knock or might not. Because now we rely on thermostats. We trust systems, wires, infrastructure, supply chains. But back then, they trusted preparation. They trusted routine. They trusted one another. And when all else failed, they trusted the fire. But even fire can't protect you from what's outside, because when the cold pushed people inside, the real danger began to roam. Chapter 3, The Hunger Months. By late January, the snow was no longer feared, it was expected. What truly chilled the bones came from beneath, the earth not above it. The slow, sinking knowledge that the food was running out. They called it the Hunger Month. The medieval calendar didn't always follow the sun or saints. It followed the gut. When the stomach clenched tight and meals grew thin, time moved differently. It stopped belonging to the church or the king. It belonged to the cellar. Surviving winter meant one thing above all: having enough food stored to last. But even that was a gamble. You could plan well and still fall short. The wind didn't care how many turnips you buried in autumn. A damp root cellar, weak harvest, a leak in the roof, any of it could spell hunger. Medieval preservation methods weren't complex, but they were precise. They smoked meat over smoldering fires, not to flavor it, but to drive out the moisture and bacteria. The smoke blackened everything, walls, ceilings, lungs, but it dried the meat, cured the fat, and extended the shelf life of precious animals slaughtered in November. They used salt the way we use refrigeration. Salt was wealth. A good family might buy it in bulk and pack it into barrels, layering pork or fish between thick slabs of it, sealing out decay. Salted herring, in particular, became the backbone of winter diets, especially for those who could not afford livestock. In colder regions, they used the earth itself. Snow pits were dug and packed with straw. Inside, blocks of ice were stacked like stones. These early freezers held meat and butter weeks beyond their natural expiration. The key was keeping it dry, buried, and undisturbed. Vegetables like cabbage, turnips, and onions were stored in cellars, sometimes hung from rafters, sometimes wrapped in straw. Grains were kept in sacks or wooden barrels, their tops covered with cloth soaked in vinegar to discourage rats and mold. Still, everything had its limit. The salt ran low, the butter turned, the meat spoiled. One by one, each small comfort faded. The average medieval peasant did not live on feasts. They lived on boiled things. A pot of pottage sat on the hearth almost always. It was a stew of whatever they had, mostly beans, cabbage, onions, grains. Bits of bone were added for flavor. Sometimes a little meat, often none. It was thick, gray, and repetitive, but it was warm. As the weeks dragged on, even the pottage grew thinner. The vegetables disappeared. The broth became cloudy. Water. Bread grew coarse. Not all bread was made from grain. In lean times, people ground acorns, tree bark, even hay into flour. This bark bread was heavy, bitter, and hard, but it filled the stomach. In northern Sweden, during particularly harsh winters, families were known to grind dried lichen into dough. In Central Europe, they baked loaves padded with dried peas and crushed nettle leaves. There was ingenuity in every famine, but it came at a cost. Hunger changed people. Not just their bodies, their faces, their posture, their sense of time. By mid-February, energy was a memory. The body turned inward. Movement slowed. Cheeks hollowed. Children stopped growing. The sick either began to recover or didn't. Sleep became longer. Work became quieter. Talk became rare. Even those who could still eat felt the weight of famine culture, a way of thinking that settled into the bones like frost. Nothing was wasted. A bit of gristle could be chewed for days. A single onion might last a week. Bones were boiled, reboiled, then gnawed to powder. People learned to live not to eat, but to survive hunger. They tied belts tighter. They slept closer. They whispered less, moved less, needed less. The silence wasn't spiritual. It was the silence of preservation. And yet, not all famine came from nature. Some came from failure of rulers, of roads, of systems. In France, in 1315, after 3 consecutive years of bad harvests, famine swept the land. Rivers overflowed. Roads turned to mud. Crops drowned. Grain prices tripled. Reports from the time describe entire villages abandoned, people wandering in rags, eating grass. In England, similar crises struck in 1437, 1527, 1586. And when food disappeared, so did order. Theft became common. Dogs were eaten. Cats, birds. There are records, quiet, few but chilling, of graveyards being disturbed, of bodies gone missing. Cannibalism was a whisper, never recorded openly, but it lingered in the background of all great famines. In 14th century France, a bishop noted seeing cooking fires where no animals had been slaughtered. In Ireland, during the famine of 1318, one chronicler wrote of black pots boiling with no name given. And in Russia, during the time of troubles, some reports from the countryside openly spoke of parents and children trading places between hunter and meat. Whether these stories were truth, exaggeration, or social warning is unclear. But the fear was real. Famine didn't just empty bellies. It loosened the rules of the world. And when the rules go, so do the lines between human and animal. The nobility often fared better, but not always. Castles could stockpile food, but they were also targets. And while the rich could import grain, they depended on roads that froze, rivers that iced, and guards who might demand double their wages just to stay warm. A king could starve in a frozen hall as easily as a shepherd in the woods. The hunger did not kneel to crowns. And in monasteries, monks prayed beside empty tables. Their stores were rationed, meals cut from twice daily to once, meat replaced with broth, wine with snowmelt, candles unlit to preserve tallow. Faith didn't fill the stomach, but it helped calm the hunger. And then there were the children, the weakest link in any famine chain. They ate last, they grew quiet first, and they were the ones most often carried, not walking when food ran low. Parents lied to them, told them stories, hid the truth. Sometimes they were given warm rocks to hold at night so their hands didn't forget the feeling of comfort. Sometimes they were told to pray to the bread gods, or that a kind spirit would bring food in dreams. But most of all, they were taught to wait, quietly, calmly, because crying burned calories. Modern historians sometimes read these accounts and marvel. How did they survive without falling into chaos? But it wasn't magic. It wasn't divine providence. It was habit. It was memory. These people had lived through hunger before. Their grandparents had lived through worse. They had rituals, recipes, and stories. They had scars that taught them. And they had each other. When famine came, they didn't panic. They endured. But famine was also a mirror. It revealed the limits of compassion, the depths of cruelty, the invisible weight of a community. If your neighbor had more food than you, did he share it? If you had more, did you hide it? Because food was power, and in winter, power was everything. But what happens when someone wants what you have? When a family starves in the woods? and sees the smoke rising from your chimney. The real danger wasn't hunger. It was the hands that knocked at your door after dark. In the hunger months, hunger was no longer private. It showed itself in the street, in the eyes of your neighbor, in the way people stopped locking their doors because there was nothing left to take, in how the baker's windows stayed dark, in how the markets fell silent. Not out of fear, but futility. By February, entire communities were running on scraps. The worst off didn't go home at night. They drifted through forests, down frozen roads, into other villages, searching for anything. Some stole, others begged. Some did both. The thin line between the two blurred fast. It wasn't always strangers who came knocking. Sometimes it was people you knew, a distant cousin, a widow from 2 houses down, a boy who once played in your yard, now older, dirt-smudged, clutching his belly. They didn't shout. They whispered, politely, almost with shame, because everyone knew the cold could kill, but hunger could humiliate, and once that dignity snapped, once the hunger took over, mercy often vanished with it. There are quiet reports, tucked in monastic logs and merchant letters, of small rural towns where entire stores were emptied in the night, not with fire, not with weapons, just with footsteps. The village baker's door found swinging open in the snow. The cheese cellar below the mill house left barren. Even candles stolen not to eat, but to barter, or to burn for light long enough to gnaw meat in hiding. Thieves weren't always outsiders. Sometimes they were the blacksmith's sons, the apothecary's wife, the priest's nephew. Theft in a medieval winter was often met with harsh punishment. Not out of law, but out of fear. If a man stole a loaf, he might be beaten in the square. But if a man stole the last loaf, the punishment turned final. There were towns where known thieves were tied to wooden posts overnight. Let the cold judge them, they said. Some villages expelled the guilty, sent them wandering in the snow. Everyone knew what that meant. Banishment. In the hunger months was a slower kind of execution. Not everyone agreed with these methods, but few argued, because forgiveness was a luxury, and in winter luxuries were deadly. As stores ran dry, rumors began to bloom. There was bread somewhere, a wealthy household hoarding it, a priest with a private cellar, a nobleman who still ate beef behind guarded walls. And so whispers turned to knocks, knocks to threats, threats to siege. In some parts of England and northern Germany, there are records of winter bread riots as early as the 12th century. Small mobs gathering outside manor gates, demanding food, throwing stones, tearing down fences. Often they found nothing. The grain was gone, or it had never been there. But in a starving crowd, truth didn't matter. Perception did. And perception is what got people killed. In cities where more mouths needed feeding, the hunger months became a kind of silent war. The butchers' alleys emptied first, then the bakeries, then the herbalists. Eventually, people scavenged pigeon nests from under rooftops, fished in frozen gutters. There are reports of broth being made from book glue, old leather, even sewage-thick moss scraped from cisterns. Children were sent to beg by candlelight, hands chapped, eyes trained to look hungrier than they were. And every time food was handed out, a choice was made. Not just about survival, about who mattered more. A child? A mother? A crippled man? No one ever said it aloud. But in every spoonful given, there was an unspoken sentence passed on someone else. Yet the hunger months didn't just pull people apart. Sometimes they drew them together. There are stories, less common, but deeply rooted, of strangers welcomed into barns, of lords opening their stores, of monks giving up their own food to feed the sick. The concept of the common table appeared: shared meals, open bowls, food laid out in chapels and halls for anyone to take. Some villages held hunger feasts, ceremonial meals where the food was meager but shared in solemn unity. Not to fill bellies, but to remind the people, we suffer together. These moments didn't stop the starvation, but they held the darkness back for a while. Winter in this world was a test, not just of the body, but of who you became when your needs went unmet. Some became generous, others turned brutal. Many hovered in between, kind in the morning, sharp in the evening, depending on how tight their belt was that day. Hunger strips people down to their cores, and what you find at that core isn't always beautiful, but it is real. And as the worst of the cold began to thaw, new dangers crept in. Spring, though warmer, was when famine often peaked. The snow melted, the cold receded, but the food stores were already gone. The new crops hadn't grown yet. The fields were mud. The rivers were high. People were too weak to sow, too tired to plow, and so they waited, thinner than ever, for green things to sprout, for bread to return, for luck to shift. But luck, like the frost, came slowly. What kept them going? Not hope. Hope fades. Discipline. Habit. Stories. Families told the same tales every night, of winters worse than this one, of ancestors who had survived by less, of years where the sun had vanished for weeks, and still the people lived. They didn't always believe those stories, but they repeated them, because repetition is a kind of faith, and sometimes faith is enough. It's easy now to imagine we're past all this, that hunger is history, that supply chains and global markets protect us. But even today, the systems we depend on are fragile. A bad harvest in one region, a supply cut in another, a war, a drought, a blockade. The shelves grow thinner, the prices rise, the fear returns. And when it does, we remember, not with our minds but in our bones, what it means to crave something that can't be found. But for some, winter wasn't about waiting to die. It was about taking. Because when a village is weak, its walls are soft, and there are always those who use hunger as a weapon. Chapter 4. Raiders, Rovers, and Wolves. Winter was not quiet. Creaked. It groaned. It echoed under boots and horses and claws. When the snow settled and the wind died, you could hear things. A crunch that didn't belong to your footsteps. A branch broken not by wind but by weight. And then, silence again. That's when you knew you weren't alone. Because hunger didn't just empty homes. It drove people out of them. The frozen roads and forest trails weren't empty in winter. They were hiding something. Someone. Men who no longer belonged to any village or oath. Men who survived by sharpening their desperation. They waited in the trees, in caves, behind crumbling stone. And when they struck, they didn't ask questions. Bandits were not a new invention. Every age had them. But during the hunger months, their numbers swelled, and so did their brutality. In regions like the Scottish Highlands, the Black Forest, the edges of the Balkans, there were tales of entire roads being owned by winter outlaws. They would descend in the dark, cloaked not in armor but in rags. Silent, fast, sometimes barefoot in snow. Desperate people don't feel cold the way others do. They burn from within. Some were former soldiers, mercenaries unpaid after a failed campaign. Others were peasants who had already lost everything. Men exiled from their own villages. Husbands who had nothing left to offer their families but their blades. Their prey wasn't always rich. In fact, it rarely was. A mule cart carrying hay was enough. A lone woman with a sack of bread. A priest traveling between parishes with a bag of salt. And they weren't always thieves first. Many started by begging. They asked for food, warmth, shelter. And when the answer was no, they returned later not to ask again but to take. In France, records from the 13th century mention winter wolves. Not animals, but roving bands of men. They moved like predators, lived off stolen scraps, hid in ruined chapels and burned out mills. They weren't just feared for what they stole, but for what they left behind. A barn burned, a dog strung up as warning, a family gone silent, not dead, just vanished. No struggle, no blood, only footprints leading away into the woods. In some regions, entire villages banded together for protection. Makeshift night watches were formed, bells strung on fences, boys sent to the rooftops with horns to sound if strangers were seen. And still, attacks came. Then there were the organized raiders. These weren't drifters. These were men under banners, rival fiefdoms, outlaw warbands, regional thugs with local ties. They were better armed, better fed, and worse in one important way. They came not just to steal, but to control. In the chaos of winter, local lords were weaker. Castles were harder to defend. Messengers froze. Armies shrank. In that vacuum of power, some smaller groups launched attacks not just to survive, but to grow. A rival baron might send 30 men to a grain village with one goal: take their storehouse. Leave enough people alive to plant again, but take everything else. These attacks were often surgical. 1 hour, one night, one rode in, and nothing left behind but ash. It wasn't just robbery. It was resource war. And while men moved with purpose, the forests moved with something older: wolves. Winter brought them down from the hills, out of the dense woodlands, and into the edge of human life. Their prey was no longer deer. It was goats, sheep, pigs left in pens, chickens gone quiet, dogs that didn't bark fast enough. But sometimes it was more than livestock. There are multiple recorded incidents, from Poland to Ireland to Hungary, of children taken in winter. Not vanished, dragged. There were tracks. There was blood. There were witnesses who lived long enough to speak of how fast they came and how little sound they made. A single wolf rarely did this. It was the pack, organized, hungry, fearless in frost. Fires helped. So did fences. But firewood was limited, and fences broke under snow. Some villages began burning, their trash farther from home to lure wolves away. Others hung bones in trees as warnings, not for the wolves but for themselves, because when the wolves came, it meant something was already failing. And with every real danger came legends. In Eastern Europe, the stories of werewolves were born not just from superstition, but from memory, of men who roamed like animals, who ate like them, who forgot how to speak and only growled. They were said to travel in groups, howl like wolves, and vanish before dawn. In truth, many of these sightings were likely starving deserters, bandits, or men so changed by hunger they no longer walked upright. But stories helped people explain what they feared, and gave names to things too broken to understand. In France, there were whispers of the cold devils, spirits in human form who only appeared when winter was at its worst. They looked like men, but their eyes glowed white. Their voices echoed. They stole food, warmth, even firelight. And if you invited them in, if you showed kindness, they vanished by morning. And so did your family. Fear doesn't wait for the snow to melt. It festers. It multiplies. And soon, every sound becomes suspect. A knock becomes a threat. A traveler becomes a spy. A stranger becomes the first step in your end. And so, many communities shut in entirely. Doors were barred. Trade slowed. Outsiders turned away at the edge of town. Wells were guarded. Roads were watched. Firelight was dimmed intentionally to avoid notice. But even within locked homes, people were afraid. Because not all attackers came from outside. Sometimes it was the man in the next room. The one who'd lost his daughter to the cold. The one who hadn't eaten in days. The one who'd started whispering to things that weren't there. Because winter breaks things. Bones, yes, but minds too. The toll of winter violence wasn't measured in deaths alone. It was seen in what people became, in what they carried with them after the snow melted. A mother who buried her youngest because she gave her last crust to her son. A boy who stopped speaking after wolves took the dog meant to protect him. A village priest who locked the doors to the chapel because he couldn't afford mercy anymore. And in each of them, a lesson carved into memory. Winter is not just cold, it's confrontation. It asks, what are you willing to do? Who are you willing to become? And yet, even amid the blood and the ice, there was one place people still believed could protect them. A place of stone and smoke, of prayer and ritual, where fire never went out and the doors stayed closed to the dark. Even the churches weren't safe. For centuries, the sanctuary was held as sacred, a space of divine protection. If someone crossed the threshold of a church, even a thief or murderer, they were believed to be beyond the reach of violence. But hunger and cold don't kneel at altars, and by the depth of winter, even sacred walls began to crack. There are surviving records from across Europe, England, Flanders, Bavaria, where monasteries were breached, not by soldiers or invaders, but by the very people the church once fed. Townsfolk who had grown too desperate to wait on blessings, ragged men and hollow-eyed women who climbed through the belfry or forced the sacristy door, not to defile but to survive. They didn't come for relics, they came for bread, and when they found it missing, already gone to the prior week's pour, their prayers turned to screams. There are reports of monks attacked, altars overturned, barrels of sacramental wine spilled just to wet dry lips. In some villages, whole congregations turned on their priests, demanding the monastery stores be opened. Sometimes there was nothing to give. Other times there was plenty, but not enough to satisfy the crowd. When the church doors no longer offered protection, people turned inward. Castles, too, faced their trials. Noble families fared better than most in the early months of winter. They had walls, guards, and deep cellars. They had imported grain, salted meat, barrels of ale. But even stone has its limits. As winter wore on and unrest grew, castles became targets, not just for looters, but for internal betrayal. Servants, who once ladled stew into silver bowls, began stealing from stores. Guards accepted bribes to open back gates. Maids whispered of where the salt was hidden. Hunger didn't just come from beyond the walls, it fermented within them. In southern Germany, there is one case of a keep burned from the inside out. The Lord had locked his stores and kept feeding only his immediate family. The rest, his guards, tenants, cooks, were given less and less. After 3 weeks, the cook and a stable boy slipped a lit torch into the granary hay. The fire reached the storehouse before anyone noticed. The Lord survived, but the food did not. For the next 2 months, the castle was under siege from winter itself. In towns, violence shifted form. It became quieter, sharper. People didn't just steal, they calculated. They watched who visited the grain merchant, who still looked well-fed, who still had dry boots, clean cloaks, who still burned candles. A fat candle became as much a sign of wealth as a horse. And when a man lit one, he might as well shout through the street, "I'm warm tonight." Knives were not drawn in alleys, but in doorways. People were followed home. Doors were broken not by bandits, but neighbors. Men returned from woods to find their homes emptied not by strangers, but cousins. And what was stolen wasn't always food. It might be a thick blanket, a shovel, a child's shoes. There was no malice in it, only survival. And then, the hunger broke minds. There are whispers of people who forgot how to speak, who sat for hours staring into unlit hearths. Women who sang lullabies to sacks of flour. Men who buried bones and couldn't say why. Children who refused to eat because they believed the food was cursed. In remote corners of Russia and Lithuania, there were cases where entire families sealed themselves in huts, not to keep raiders out, but to preserve sanity. They hung charms from ceilings, kept fires lit through the night, and spoke only in prayers. And when someone began to act strange, too quiet, too cheerful, too still, they were watched, not with concern, but fear, because hunger broke more than the body. It broke trust. And what of the healers, the wise women, the herbmen, the midwives and forest wanderers who once knew the plants that healed and the roots that calmed? By the second month of snow, even they were questioned. If a family starved while their neighbor's child stayed healthy, people began to talk. Was it luck, or was something else at work? In Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and Hungary, there are records of winter witch hunts. Nothing grand, nothing like the fevered inquisitions of later centuries. Just quiet executions. A woman drowned in an ice hole. A man nailed into his hut and burned. It was said to be mercy to protect the rest. And after the screams stopped, no one spoke of it again. But amid the madness, something strange occurred. The hunger unified the dying with the dangerous. Raiders and villagers, thieves and farmers, everyone began to blur, because by late March, no one was full anymore. The raiders who'd once struck with confidence began to disappear. Their ranks thinned by cold, ambushes, bad luck. Villages, though battered, were harder now, more alert, more bitter. They knew the signs. They slept in shifts. They buried their cellars. They planted traps. Some raiders turned back to farming. Others vanished into forests. A few wandered into larger towns and never made it back out. Even wolves became fewer. Starvation thinned the packs. Those that remained grew cautious again. The smell of torches now meant fire, not weakness. And just like that, the air began to change. It was subtle, a warmth in the wind, a softer crunch beneath boots, a sky that turned a shade lighter before dusk. Then drips, ice loosening its grip, water rolling from rooftops, fields breathing steam, and then the mud. Winter never left cleanly. It broke down in weeks of sludge and ash. Roads turned impassable. Horses stumbled. Floods claimed low fields. But no one cared. The melt meant movement. The thaw meant time again. To repair, to forage, to look forward. And to remember, because if winter brought out the beast, spring brought out the mirror. People saw what they'd done, what they'd allowed, who they'd buried, who they'd become. And though new crops would grow and grain would return, the hunger months remained in them, not just in memory, but in how they planted, how they saved, how they spoke. Children grew up different. Wives became harder, husbands more silent. Some homes never rebuilt. Others sealed off the rooms where someone had starved. And when the wind shifted cold again in late October, everyone remembered. But while most prepared quietly, others chose a different path. Because for some medieval men, hunger wasn't a curse. It was a weapon. Next, we walk into the world of those who sharpened fear itself. Chapter 5. Castles and cabins, shelter in the storm. In the dead of medieval winter, shelter wasn't just protection. It was destiny. It decided how warm your nights would be, how many layers you'd need to sleep in, and whether you'd wake to the sound of wind or someone breaking down your door. But more than anything, shelter marked the line between who lived well and who merely tried to live at all. The world, covered in frost, revealed its two truths clearly: the castle and the cabin, stone and straw, feast and famine. And when the snow came down hard, it didn't fall equally on all roofs. Inside the castle walls, winter looked different. Tapestries hung thick on stone, not for beauty but insulation. Hearths blazed in every room that mattered. Some halls burned logs longer than a man's height. Beneath every great table were foot warmers, clay jugs filled with hot water, woolen slippers dried by firelight. The lord's family wrapped themselves in fur and linen, soft enough to sleep in, fine enough to show off. Even in the coldest seasons, their clothes changed daily. And when the snow piled outside, life inside still moved. Feasts continued. Music echoed down corridors. Servants carried trays of roasted meat, spiced wine, steaming, bowls of barley and bone. The nobles might mutter of the cold, but few of them suffered it. In their storehouses, grain, preserved fruit, salted pork, dried herbs, barrels of beer, crates of fish, sometimes wine, brought in from southern ports. They could outlast weeks, even months of snow without fear. And if the peasants below starved, that was a matter for politics, not panic. The castle, in truth, was a fortress not just of stone, but of privilege. Knights and guards patrolled not only for security, but to ensure peace among their own ranks. Desperate, servants were watched closely. Kitchens were locked at night. The lord's family remained distant from most of the staff, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. To get too close was to become vulnerable, because even within these warm walls, tension simmered. There were more mouths than ever before. Cold caused illness. The cook might fall sick. A guard might vanish. Servants talked in whispers. One bad decision from above, and the stability of the castle could shift overnight. And worse, the world outside watched. Down the hills, in the forests and valleys, the poor huddled in cabins that were barely holding together. Thatch roofs let in wind. Gaps in the timber let out warmth. Mud floors froze by dusk. If you were lucky, you shared your hut with animals, their breath and body heat the only added warmth. Entire families, 6, sometimes 10 people, shared a single room. No privacy, no silence, just the steady coughing of the old, the whimpering of the cold, the smell of wet wool, smoke, and unwashed skin. Beds were straw bundles, covered in rough-spun blankets patched year after year. Boots were dried by fire if there was firewood. Most meals were cooked over a small stone hearth. Smoke funneled through a hole in the roof, though often it just gathered inside, making your eyes water and lungs ache. There was no pantry, no cellar, only the hope that what you saved from the harvest hadn't rotted. There's something that happens in close quarters like these. You begin to merge with your family, your animals, the smell of your sweat and fear. Privacy dissolves. Emotions tighten. And when the cold gnaws deep into bone, every cough sounds like a warning. Every long silence feels like something ending. Children were often kept closest to the fire. They curled up with dogs or goats, wrapped in whatever fur or cloth could be spared. Mothers fed them thin porridge from wooden bowls, their fingers raw from washing, sewing, scraping ice from buckets. Fathers rose before dawn to find firewood, often just branches fallen in the night. If lucky, they hunted rabbits. If desperate, they boiled bark. Everything was rationed. No one ate until the oldest and youngest were fed. And still, some nights, someone simply didn't wake up. There's a phrase found in a 14th century village record from Burgundy. The snow eats the poor first. It wasn't metaphor. It was math. The poorest homes had the least protection, the fewest stores, and the greatest burden. If a family lost its goat, it meant no milk, no wool, no trade. If they lost a parent, it meant labor gone. If they lost their health, it meant the entire home began to collapse inward like a roof under too much frost. And the tragedy was not that people died. It was how predictably they died. The emotional toll was immense, even when unstated. Parents watched their children shrink. Elders stared into empty pots. Some sang to themselves quietly, repeating old songs they learned as children, not for joy but for rhythm, for something to keep the mind moving. Others sat silent for days, speaking only to the fire, and some began to walk out into the woods, into the storm, mumbling things that didn't make sense. Sometimes those who left didn't return. Sometimes they were the lucky ones. And yet, despite it all, somehow they endured. Neighbors would bring scraps when they could. A slice of smoked meat, a broken tool mended, a warning of raiders spotted on the road. Old women boiled herbs and passed around teas to fight sickness. Children played, even if only briefly, chasing one another in the snow until their fingers burned. There were quiet kindnesses, woven between misery. A mother giving her last scarf to a neighbor's child. A boy letting the family dog sleep on his chest for warmth. A man giving up his only blanket for his wife and unborn child. These acts didn't cure the cold, but they made surviving feel like something more than just waiting to die. As for the castles, even they weren't untouched. Disease crept in, sometimes through visitors, sometimes through trade. Servants carried fevers from one room to another. A noble's child fell sick and took the nursemaid with her. A feast ended with food gone foul and half the court bedridden by morning. Isolation became paranoia. In one documented case, a noblewoman in Navarre ordered her entire staff quarantined in the cellar for 2 weeks after a kitchen boy sneezed during dinner. No one was allowed into her chamber. Meals were passed through a locked slot. She refused to see her own children. No one died, but when she emerged, her hair had turned white at the temples. Some say from fear, others from guilt. And all the while, outside both cabin and castle, the wind howled. Not louder, not crueler, just consistent. The kind of wind that reminds you what you are. Flesh, breath, heat, and the need to protect it. And as January turned to February, and then to March, both lords and peasants began to ask the same quiet question, not aloud, but inside. Will this be the year the snow doesn't melt? Because it wasn't just warmth they were waiting for, it was permission to hope again. But even hope has limits. And even walls, no matter how thick, can't protect against what the mind becomes in the dark. Shelter, for all its strength, could never shield the mind. As winter deepened, even the walls that kept out wolves and wind grew cold with silence. What began as safety often turned into confinement. The fire still burned, but the people around it had changed. Warmth does not always mean comfort. Sometimes it just prolongs your fear. In the castles, paranoia settled thick in the air. Lords who once gave open orders now whispered them. Visitors were reduced. Letters came less frequently. Trust unraveled, thread by thread. One nobleman in southern France was said to have started sleeping in his armory rather than his chambers because too many servants knew where he kept his wine. Another in Denmark dismissed half his kitchen staff and assigned guards to his pantries. He claimed they'd been stealing, but those who knew him said his real fear was poison, because in a house full of full plates, envy can be louder than hunger. In the villages, madness took subtler forms. The old woman who swore she could hear the thatch whispering her name. The boy who stopped blinking for hours, just staring at the fire like he was watching something crawl out. The man who nailed his door shut from the inside and told his wife they had to sleep sitting up so the ghosts wouldn't step on their lungs. There was no diagnosis for it. No word for cabin fever or seasonal depression. But they knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how to fix it. So they sang, they prayed, they drank. And when that didn't help, they waited. Because by this point, everyone was waiting for something. In the castle, they waited for news. Messengers from the capital, merchants brave enough to cross the mountains, letters sealed in wax that proved the world hadn't ended. In the cabins, they waited for birdsong, for rivers to break, for the sound of the woods cracking under new life instead of old frost. But waiting can turn heavy. It bends spines, it slows breath, pulls you inward, and for some, it breaks you. There are records of entire households falling to silence. Not death, just absence. No one stirred the pot. No one mended a boot. No one stepped outside for firewood. One traveler wrote of a family in the lowlands of Bohemia. For members still alive who hadn't spoken in days, he found them seated around a cold hearth. No signs of struggle, no illness, just silence, like the winter had paused them, like they'd stopped believing spring would come and chose to freeze in place. Not suicide, not madness, just surrender. And yet, while some broke quietly, others grew hard. Especially those in the middle, the smallholders, the skilled peasants, the merchants without walls but too proud to beg. They had just enough to survive, but not enough to feel safe. They became disciplined, efficient, scarred. The kind of people who rationed a single candle over 6 nights, who taught their children to chew slower, not speak, while eating, and sleep with their socks inside their tunics to keep them warm. They didn't cry. They didn't pray aloud. They didn't waste hope on what they couldn't reach. These were the ones who came out of winter like iron pulled from fire, shaped by pressure, hardened by fear. And when spring finally arrived, it was these people who became the next leaders, the next merchants, the quiet elders. No one questioned, because they had endured not just cold but clarity. They knew now what mattered, what lasted, and what didn't. Even within castles, this clarity spread. Some lords learned from their isolation. They stopped hosting grand feasts and started storing grain. They rebuilt their walls with less decoration and more insulation. They restructured their staff, gave more autonomy to cooks and quartermasters, and listened more closely when a village priest said the stores were low. Winter taught them that vanity was flammable. But not all lords learned. Some came out angrier, meaner, determined to never feel weak again. They raised taxes, They ordered new patrols. They punished theft with greater violence. Some of the most brutal springtime decrees came from those who had survived winter not with wisdom, but with fury. In the monasteries, where stone was thick and food was rationed with near-scientific care, things were quieter, but not untouched. Monks, especially in colder regions like northern England and the Alps, kept meticulous logs. They wrote of supplies dwindling, of brothers falling ill, of prayer schedules shortening because candles were too dear to burn past dusk, and in some darker entries, confessions of temptation. One entry from 1321 reads, "Today I thought of breaking fast before the bell. I imagined it. I imagined it again. And in my sin, I wept not for my soul, but for my weakness." Spiritual hunger became real hunger, and real hunger didn't care about oaths. Even among the devout, winter revealed the edge of belief. And not all who looked into the cold found their God. Staring back, by mid-March, signs of change arrived. Not warmth, not yet, but softness, the edges of icicles dripping, the frozen streams stirring. The air tasted different, like something had been released, and so began the reckoning. In castles, inventories were taken. How much had been lost? How much had been stolen? Who had vanished? Who had betrayed? Some servants were punished. Others were elevated. Most were replaced quietly. The hierarchy, shaken in frost, reasserted itself tighter than before. In cabins, dead were buried. Fires were rebuilt. Children were measured and weighed, like saplings after a storm. Every tool was inspected. Every fence post reset. No one trusted anything anymore, not even wood that had stood for decades, because now they knew survival was only half the story. Rebuilding meant confronting who they had become to get through it. There was no celebration when the snow melted. No music, no feasts, just work, because everyone knew the truth. Next winter was already coming. They had survived this one, yes, but not all had, and not all would again. So they gathered, hoarded, prepared. They whispered stories to the children, not fairy tales, but warnings. They taught them to sharpen blades, to bind wounds, to spot frostbite before it turned black. They told them, keep the grain dry, the water clean, the fire small but constant. And above all, trust the silence, but never forget what it hides. But for all the horrors behind doors and stone, another danger stalked the medieval winter, one without shelter, without mercy. In the next chapter, we follow the outcasts, the forgotten, and the lost, the ones who wandered the winter roads because they had nowhere else to go. Chapter 6, Madness by Candlelight. Winter didn't just freeze rivers and fields, it froze the mind. Long before there was a word for seasonal depression, before terms like mental health, or cabin fever, or isolation-induced psychosis, people in the medieval world simply knew this. Something happened to the mind. When the sun disappeared, the nights grew long, not just longer in hours, but in presence. Night didn't just cover the land, it began to occupy it. You lit your candle at 4 in the afternoon, and it burned past midnight. You didn't count hours by the sun anymore, but by how many times you had to replace the wick. And in that darkness, your thoughts began to stretch. In the villages, families huddled together, not always out of affection but necessity. The cold pressed in from every wall. The wind crawled through every crack. And the silence, when it came, was never quiet. It buzzed in the ears. It hummed in the mind. Children were first to feel it. They'd begin to whimper in their sleep. Some began to walk in their dreams, shuffling, barefoot across frozen floors, murmuring words no one understood. Mothers would find them standing by the door, reaching for something unseen. The elders called it night walking. They said it was just the soul trying to stretch its legs. Others said it was the dead, whispering in the ears of the young. A bad omen, a thinning of the veil. So the doors were tied shut at night, not just locked, tied with twine and iron. Candles were placed in windows, facing east. Mirrors were covered. No one slept alone. Still, the dreams kept coming. In remote parts of Norway and Poland, it was called snow sleep, a kind of waking trance that took people in the middle of winter. One moment they were mending clothes or cleaning pots, then they'd stop. Just stop, frozen in place, mouth open, eyes glassy. Sometimes they'd stay that way for minutes, sometimes for hours. When they came back, they spoke of strange things. Not dreams exactly, images, faces without eyes, voices without mouths, a fire that wouldn't warm, a door that opened to nowhere. No one knew what caused it, but they blamed the season. And in that way, winter was made into a living thing, a force that not only killed the body but corrupted the soul. In monasteries, the problem was silence. The monks, disciplined, devout, isolated, were particularly vulnerable. Their days were ruled by ritual and quiet. But winter threw even that balance off. There was less movement, fewer visitors, fewer daylight hours for prayer or gardening or writing. What was left was interior time. One monk from an abbey near Ghent wrote, "I heard the devil speak to me today. He said nothing cruel, only truths I feared." Another recorded hearing scratching behind the chapel walls. Day after day, when he opened the panel, there was nothing, no rat, no wind, just stone. And yet the sound returned. By February, several brothers had stopped participating in communal meals. They ate alone. They prayed longer. They began writing feverishly, not in Latin, but in scrawled, panicked fragments. Many of these writings were burned by the abbots, dismissed as spiritual confusion. But one fragment survived. It reads, "Do not light a candle unless you want to see what's really in the room." And then came the night terrors, not just nightmares, not dreams, but the moments just between sleep and waking. That sliver of time when your breath stops and you feel, without question, that you are not alone. Some called it the night hag, others the demon in the rafters. In modern terms, we know it as sleep paralysis, the body frozen while the mind remains alert. But in medieval times, they had no explanation, only experience. One account from rural England describes a black shape pressing on the chest of a boy for 3 nights in a row. He could not scream, could not move, only cry. By the 4th night, the family had tied a crucifix to his chest. The terrors stopped, or at least he stopped speaking of them. Another tale tells of a man who saw his dead father in the flames of a candle. Not in a dream, but while waking. The face appeared in the wax's shimmer. It blinked, and then it screamed. The man never lit a candle again. Not all feared what they saw. Some embraced it, because as the priests began visiting less, as churches closed early and monasteries shuttered for the storm, people turned to older comforts, the ones buried beneath the surface of Christianity, the ones whispered by grandmothers and shepherds and midwives. They lit candles made from animal fat, not beeswax, burned herbs the priests had forbidden, salted their thresholds, left milk outside not for stray cats, but for the others. In Brittany and Galicia, stories of house spirits returned. Small, invisible creatures who could bring luck or ruin, depending on how you treated them. It was said they hated loud voices and loved soft singing, that they would keep your fire from dying if you left them honey or warm milk. And when the flames refused to die out at night, or when smoke from the chimney curled in shapes too deliberate to be natural, it was said the spirits were pleased. In Eastern Europe, belief turned darker. They spoke of Zmora, phantoms of the forgotten dead who entered homes through keyholes and pressed down on sleepers. These weren't demons exactly. They were once human. Often, it was said, they were the souls of those buried improperly in winter, too shallow, too rushed, too cold. And they came back not for vengeance, but for warmth. So families placed coins on the eyes of the dead. They kept a fire burning near the burial mound for 3 nights. They hung bells by the doors, not to ward them off, but to let them in gently. Because fear, in its own way, becomes a kind of hospitality. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of all wasn't the terror, the ghosts, or the madness. It was the realization that no one could be trusted to stay sane forever. By the 3rd or 4th month of winter, families began watching each other closely. A daughter who laughed too loud. At night, a father who slept with his boots on. A brother who refused to eat unless it was cold food. These weren't quirks. They were warnings. Some families developed rituals not based in religion but routine. They would count each other's breaths before bed, say the same goodnight phrase, check the windows 3 times, stir the stew clockwise. It wasn't superstition. It was survival, a way to stay tethered, because when your world is made of dark, smoke, and fear, repetition is the only light you have. But even rituals could only hold so much. For those left too long in the dark, the line between the real and the imagined didn't just blur, it disappeared. As winter deepened and the days flattened into one long, unchanging stretch of darkness, the border between reality and imagination began to quietly erode. The walls that had once offered comfort now loomed. The fire that once meant life now cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move even when no one breathed. Every home, no matter how grand or poor, became a theater of silence where thoughts echoed louder than words ever could. In many villages, paranoia became the common tongue. A misplaced item, an axe, a ladle, a pair of boots, was no longer just lost. It had been taken, or cursed, or hidden by someone who wished you harm. And when accusations flew, they often landed on the same people. The widow who lived alone, the boy who didn't speak, the old man who refused to come to Mass, the ones already set apart. One such case is recorded in the margins of a church ledger from Friesland. A young girl, no more than 12, claimed to hear singing coming from under the floor. Her parents dismissed it until she began to recite the words aloud. The song wasn't Latin. It wasn't even the local dialect. It was something older, something no one could place. They stopped lighting the hearth in that corner of the house. A month later, the girl fell silent. She never spoke again. Elsewhere, people turned to ritual as a way of remembering themselves. In a town near Lake Constance, families placed sprigs of dried rosemary above their doors, not for flavor, but to guard the thoughts. In parts of Wales, red woolen cords were tied to the wrists of children before bed, so they wouldn't be pulled into the dark during dreams. The ritual wasn't spoken of. It was simply done, handed down from those who had endured too many winters to argue with wisdom older than reason. In some remote valleys, candles were no longer used for light but as clocks. 1 inch burned meant an hour gone. An entire taper was a day closer to spring. People marked their survival in inches of wax and drops of tallow. And when the candles ran out, they turned to memory, reciting long tales and family lines by firelight, not to entertain but to stay tethered to the past. Because forgetting even a single name meant the dark was winning. In many homes, hallucination became routine. It wasn't always terrifying. In fact, most visions arrived softly. A man might see his long-dead mother stirring a pot in the corner of the room, humming her old kitchen songs. Child might describe a white bird that landed on the windowsill each night, even when the snow was thick and no feathers were found outside. A woman walking home from the frozen stream might suddenly feel like someone was walking beside her, not with menace but familiarity. None of it was questioned aloud, because those in the grip of darkness understood something modern minds often forget. Not all illusions are dangerous. Some are protective, a buffer between sanity and despair. What became dangerous was when the visions turned ugly, when the bird became a shadow, when the mother stopped humming and began weeping, when the presence beside you began whispering things you'd never dare say. Then came the fear, not of being mad, but of what might happen if others noticed. This was when people began hiding their symptoms. A man would laugh a little too quickly. A girl would pretend to be asleep even when wide-eyed with fear. Some families would agree silently not to speak of the things they saw or heard. If you confessed to visions, you risked exile. Or worse, in some areas of the Alps, entire households were cast out for dream taint. It didn't matter if they were sane. that mattered was whether they said something that made others uneasy. One wrong phrase, one slip of the tongue, one admission that you saw something strange, and you were marked. Those marked often became wanderers. And in the deepest winters, wandering was death with a longer leash. And yet, others leaned fully into the dark. In parts of the Baltic coast, small cults emerged, informal gatherings, not always religious, but united by belief that the winter was more than weather, that it was a living cycle, and that to endure it, one had to align with it. They lit fires not in hearths, but in patterns in fields, sometimes sacrificing livestock to feed the cold. They smeared ash on their faces, wore cloaks of bark and fur, and sang chants meant to anchor the mind. In some of these cults, madness was not feared, it was revered, a sign of having seen too much, understood too deeply. The ones who screamed into the frost weren't mad. They were messengers. These groups rarely lasted more than a few seasons. When spring came, they either disbanded or vanished into the woods. Some were burned out by nearby villagers. Others simply disappeared. But their stories remained, passed quietly, repeated around hearths, wondered about by children who asked, what if they were right? Then finally the break. Late February, early March, a softness in the mornings, a breeze that didn't bite. The candles still burned, but now, you could see the light creep into the window before they were gone. And with that light came something stranger than madness, the return of the ordinary. Suddenly, people began to feel shame. Shame for the things they'd believed, for the things they'd said, for the sounds they heard and visions they welcomed. The fire no longer danced with spirits, it was just fire. The house, once full of whispers, was just creaking. There's a deep sadness that comes with leaving the dark behind. It's not that you miss it, but you miss the certainty of your fear, the clear rules, the defined limits. Spring brought too many colors, too much noise, too many choices. Some people never readjusted. They remained distant, speaking only when necessary. Others left, wandering not out of need but because the world had become too loud to trust. And a few tried to bring the dark with them by refusing to put away their rituals, refusing to light every room, keeping their mirrors covered, keeping their candles burning even when the sun was high. They became the village eccentrics, the ones you respected but avoided, the ones who had been somewhere the rest of you hoped never to go. And yet all of them had survived. They had made it through the long dark, through the cold that cracked minds and stretched time, through the silence that crept through doors and under skin. And they remembered, always remembered, that fire is not just warmth, it's memory, that stories are not just entertainment, they are armor, and that when the world turns dark again, as it always does, it is not the strongest who survive, but the ones who know what waits inside the silence. But while some feared shadows and silence, others used them. Next, we walk with the forgotten predators of the frozen world. Outlaws, wolves, and those who learn to live with no law but hunger. Chapter 7, Faith, Magic, and the Darker Gods. As the cold deepened and the nights stretched endlessly, survival became a question not only of firewood and food but of faith. Not all faith was the same. In great stone cathedrals, far from the wilderness, it was organized, structured chants, incense, gold-framed relics, locked behind glass. But in the forgotten places, the forests, the highlands, the swamps, faith was something else entirely. It wasn't painted in light. It was scratched into the dark. Because for those who lived where the land was cruel and help was days away, belief wasn't just a comfort. It was a negotiation. In the foothills of the Carpathians, they whispered of wells that healed, not because of science or miracle, but because they were never meant to be found. Wells that ran warm in winter, wells that were always full even in drought. You didn't drink from them without leaving something behind. A button, a strand of hair, a tooth from a pig. These weren't Christian rituals. The priests said they were superstitions. But those who lived longest didn't listen to the priests. They listened to the land. In the alpine valleys, candle blessings became sacred. Each year, on the Feast of Candlemas, villagers brought their last unburned candles to be blessed at the church. But not everyone waited for the priest. Some went the night before, coating the candles in lamb's blood, burying them beneath frozen soil, whispering names of saints and ancestors. These candles weren't for light, they were for protection. When lit, they were said to burn lies, to reveal illnesses. Before they struck, to scare off things that moved without footprints in the snow. In some homes, these blessed candles were only used in childbirth or death, when a soul stood too close to the veil. But not all rituals were so gentle. In forgotten parts of Estonia and Lithuania, old gods had never truly died. They had simply hidden. Families still whispered to the forest. Milk was poured onto roots, bread left under trees. Chickens were tied to stones and drowned in frozen lakes to bring luck for the hunt. Pagan? Possibly. Evil? Not to those who had nothing left but hunger and fear. The line between Christianity and old belief blurred in the cold. Saints became interchangeable with spirits. The Virgin Mary was called upon with the same voice once used for fertility goddesses. Jesus shared altars with carved wooden idols that no one admitted to owning. The snow didn't care what god you called, only that you offered something back. And then there were the blood rites, rare, unspoken, almost myth, but they happened. In a village in the Finnish north, a chronicler noted a ritual not seen in the wider world for centuries. In the dead of January, the villagers gathered in silence. No instruments, no singing, only firelight and fur. They led a single goat to the center of the square. Its legs were dyed red, not with paint, but with crushed berries, the blood of a rabbit and ash. They didn't speak as they killed it. They didn't cook the meat. They didn't bury the body. They left it in the snow, head turned toward the woods. When asked why, the elder woman simply said, "To remind the trees we're still here." In parts of Scotland, witchcraft was never truly gone, only renamed. The wise women were consulted more in winter than in any other season. For warmth potions, for dream charms, for ways to keep a newborn alive when there was no cow's milk, or to stop a man from going mute after he saw something white walking across the frozen lake. They brewed teas of bitter roots. They smoked herbs that made your limbs feel like water. They buried feathers under thresholds and painted protective runes above beds in ashes mixed with blood and wine. Were they witches? Some said yes. Others said they were saints in disguise. Most simply didn't ask, because when your child was sick and your cellar was empty, you didn't care what kind of magic saved you. You just wanted it to work. Still, the church tried to press down on these practices, tried to tighten its grip during the winter months, when fear gave them leverage. Priests carried holy relics from door to door, pieces of saints' bones sealed in silver, fragments of the true cross, bottled oil from Jerusalem. Villagers kissed them with cracked lips, then whispered their private fears into the priest's ears. "My husband's mind is going. My daughter sees shadows when she prays. We hear something breathing behind the barn wall." The priests offered absolution, prayers, sometimes even salt and water, blessed in haste. But they knew deep down that it wasn't always enough, because sometimes what people feared couldn't be cast out. Sometimes it was something they invited in. One tale, half true and wholly terrifying, drifted across Eastern Europe during the 14th century. The story of a village that had waited too long for spring. They say it was near the edge of a forest, nestled against a mountain that blocked most of the morning light. Snow came early that year and stayed longer than ever before. By February, 3 children had died. By March, the cattle were gone. By April, the village was silent, except for the one house with smoke still rising. A traveler, trader, maybe, or messenger came upon the place. Every house was empty, doors open, beds untouched. But one house, set apart from the others, was still warm inside. In the center of the room was a ring of ash, and inside it, a pile of bones. Goat, chicken, dog, something else. On the wall, a symbol, burned in Not written, not carved, burned. He didn't stay long. The next village he reached, he said only this: spring didn't come, but something else did. They say he refused to speak after that. And when snow fell again the next year, he hung a goat skull above his door. Not for decoration, because when the weather turns and the sky offers no answer, the people below it begin to do desperate things. They bury charms. They burn herbs. They whisper to saints and demons alike. They do not ask for heaven. They ask for survival. And survival rarely cares which god you serve, only how much you're willing to give. For those who endured the longest winters, belief was no longer about choosing between light and dark. It became about living with both. A man could pray to Christ at dawn, kneel in front of a Marian altar with frost in his beard and the smell of tallow on his hands, and then, by nightfall, he might pour honey onto a flat stone and whisper to the spirit in his barn. Contradiction didn't matter. Coherence was a luxury for warm seasons and well-fed minds. Winter didn't reward clarity. It rewarded sacrifice. And sacrifice came in many forms. One of the most enduring folk practices in the highlands of Central Europe involved the three-night fire. It was a tradition born from desperation and held together by memory. On the coldest night of the year, usually sometime in mid-February, families would gather what remained of their firewood and build a single, massive flame. This was no hearth fire, it was a cleansing ritual, a signal to the world. Beyond that, they still had power left to burn. They sat around the flames in silence, wrapped in wool, faces blank. Bread and broth were passed around. But no one spoke until dawn. On the third night, if the fire had survived without dying once, they would bury its ashes at the edge of the forest. It was said to ward off sickness, ensure fertile animals, and stop the dead from wandering too close. There are records of this rite continuing well into the early 17th century. In some places even longer, because it worked or because they believed it did. In winter, there was little difference. The blurred line between sanity and salvation was most visible in the children. Children were the ones most often seen talking to things that weren't there, pointing at shapes in the snow, claiming to hear music beneath the ice. They were also the ones most often believed, not because their parents were naive, but because they had no reason to lie. One account from Western Hungary tells of a girl who, during the winter of 1383, stopped eating for 5 days, not out of illness, but because, as she claimed, the trees were feeding her in her dreams. The villagers were horrified, but not because they thought she was possessed. They feared she was chosen. She was taken to a chapel for cleansing, bathed in blessed wine. The floor of her family's hut was dug up, and the stones rearranged. Afterward, she began eating again. But she never spoke another word in her life. She lived to be 54, and she never left the valley. The people there called her the Hollow Saint. Animals were deeply woven into these winter beliefs. Cats were both feared and adored, said to carry the souls of the restless dead, yet also capable of sensing evil before it entered a home. In Scandinavian tales, white cats that slept beside newborns were seen as guardians. But black cats that circled a door 3 times in the snow were omens of death. If you saw one and ignored it, they said, someone would freeze before the moon turned again. Goats, long associated with the devil in Christian theology, had a stranger place in the winter mythology of rural Europe. In many villages, a goat was not a symbol of evil, but of sacrifice. During the harshest months, the Yule goat, an effigy made from straw and bloodied wool, was paraded through town, sometimes burned at the first thaw. In more secretive areas, a real goat was killed under the new moon, its entrails red like a map, its bones boiled and buried beside the livestock pens. It was not cruelty, it was communication between people and the world behind the snow. And sometimes, people became the ritual. In years of particular hardship, records speak of the winter walkers, men and women who volunteered to spend a night alone in the woods as offerings. Not quite punishment, not quite martyrdom. They would wear no shoes, carry no food, take nothing with them but a bundle of dried herbs and a single candle. If they returned, they were treated with reverence, never questioned, never burdened again. These people often took on a strange silence afterward, still and blank-eyed, slow to respond to normal speech. If they did not return, no search parties were sent. One chronicle from Saxony simply writes, "We sent our silence into the woods. It did not come back, so we slept soundly. That was enough." Even illness had its place in these ritual beliefs. When someone fell sick in winter, the cure was not always herbs or heat. It was sometimes confession, not to a priest, but to the house itself. The family would sit the sick person at the center of the room. A candle would be placed at each cardinal direction. Then, in soft voices, questions were asked. Who did you curse? What did you hide from your brother? Which oath did you break when the ice first fell? It wasn't punishment. It was considered cleansing. A belief that sickness had roots in secrets, and that speaking them aloud could melt the rot in the body. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But those who died after this ritual were said to die clean, and their corpses were buried with smiles carved into soft wood placed in their hands, because death, when it came clean, was seen as a victory. Not all rituals were so gentle. In one fictionalized fragment, based on dozens of folkloric elements from across Europe, we imagine a village under a blood moon. A goat is tied to a pole in the center of a snowy courtyard. Its fur is painted with sigils in charcoal and ochre. The villagers wear cloaks turned inside out. Their shoes are wrapped in thistle. No one speaks. The fire is not in the hearth, but in the barn. Lit not to warm, but to send smoke into the night sky, smoke mixed with bone dust and lavender, so that it rises sweet and strong. An elder kneels and speaks, not to God, but to the watchers. She says, "Spring has forgotten us. We offer what we have. We ask for your eyes to turn eastward again." Then the knife is drawn. The goat's throat is cut, but not with cruelty. It is laid down gently, its blood caught in a bowl, carved from last year's Yule log. A small amount is painted on every doorframe in the village. No music is played, only breath and flame, and the sound of snow continuing to fall, like ash from a dying world. Whether this scene happened or many like it, the truth it tells is deeper than fact. That in a world of endless dark, the only way people could fight winter was to ritualize it, to speak to it, to honor, or to pretend they had power over it, even for a moment. And so, year after year, the cycle continued. Spring came, or it didn't. People lived, or they vanished. Some remembered their rights, others buried them. But all knew that the next time snow fell thick and the night grew too long, they would light a candle, not to see, but to be seen, by whatever still walked in the woods, by whatever still remembered their names. But not everyone who faced the dark did it inside walls. Some survived it out in the open, with knives, with hunger, with nothing but instinct and rage. Because beyond prayer, beyond ritual, there were others who took what they needed to survive, and left only bones behind. Chapter 8. When the snow didn't melt. It starts with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that lingers after everything has stopped. No footsteps, no crackling fires, no distant bleats of livestock or voices calling from barn to field. Just the wind, steady and cruel, as it pours through open doorways and over roofs long buried in ice. There were winters when the snow never seemed to melt, when the thaw came late or never came at all. Some said it was punishment, others said it was a test. But whatever the cause, the result was always the same. People disappeared. Not in ones or twos, but entire villages gone, as if plucked from the world and swallowed by the cold. And the worst part was that no one ever found them in time. One such place was Vardahus, a small fishing village once nestled against a fjord in northern Norway. Records show it had been populated for nearly 2 centuries. Its people were hardy, used to brutal weather, to long darkness, to the sea freezing thick and early. But in 1364, After a particularly violent ice storm and a year of poor fishing, Vardahus simply vanished. The next travelers who passed through found every house intact. Tables still set, beds made, food stores, untouched though frozen solid. A few crows sat on the rooftops. Nothing else moved. And in the church, a frozen woman was found kneeling in front of the altar, her skin blackened with frostbite, her hands in prayer. But the altar candles were burned down to the base. There were no tracks in the snow, no signs of violence, no blood, just cold and silence, like the village had sighed and given up. And Vardahus wasn't alone. Throughout medieval Europe, dozens of settlements are recorded as having gone dark during winter, never to be resettled. These weren't battlefield losses or plague-cleared ruins. These were quiet disappearances. Places like Lomfirth in Scotland, where legend tells of a single survivor, an old man found naked in a pile of hay, raving about wolves with human eyes. Or Deerfeld, deep in the German forests, where every door was found locked from the inside. The hearths cold, the windows shuttered. A traveler opened one cottage to find 13 people frozen together under a pile of furs. No signs of violence, no signs of panic, just stillness, and something scrawled on the wooden beam above their heads. The snow spoke. We listened. Modern archaeology has unearthed frozen corpses still seated at tables, faces preserved by cold, eyes open. In the Alps, in Siberia, even on the Scandinavian coast, some bodies were found in groups, some curled alone in corners. Some appear to have died in the middle of prayer, others with knives in hand. No one ever buried them. No one survived long enough to care. The snow became their tombstone, but sometimes the snow wasn't the only killer. The worst winters came when plague and frost arrived together. When death came not as a blade but as a weight, a sickness that thinned the blood, followed by a cold that froze what remained. In the early 15th century, a Black Death recurrence swept through regions of France and Bohemia. That same year, tree rings suggest one of the coldest decades in Europe in centuries. A double blow, disease and cold. Imagine a village already locked in by snowdrifts 10 feet high. Now add a fever. No strength to break ice for water. No one healthy enough to chop wood. No priest to bury the dead. No family left to mourn them. Entire communities would die with their windows shuttered, leaving behind only the sound of rats gnawing at the bones under beds of snow. From this came stories, not always true but always feared, of lost children wandering alone, clothed in rags, eyes glazed, knocking on doors miles from their villages. Of abandoned hamlets where lights flickered for weeks, though no one lived inside. Of bells ringing from empty churches, heard at night through the frost-covered hills. One tale from Poland speaks of a monastery buried in snow for 7 weeks. When the thaw finally came, rescuers found all the monks frozen in place, except one, who had carved prayers into the walls with his fingernails. The writing ended mid-sentence, and there were deeper fears, too, that something lived in the snow, that when people grew too weak or too mad to resist, they heard whispers, saw figures walking slowly across the white long after sunset, that they opened their doors not to bandits or wolves, but to something else entirely. Not demons, not gods, winter itself, taking the form of what you missed most. A child's voice, a mother's face, a lover's hand pressing warm against the window pane. And when you opened the door, you didn't scream, you just left. We now speak of these things in stories shrouded by time. But what if it happened again? What if the snow returned and never left? In a world so reliant on energy, a single long blackout could reshape civilization. A major winter storm knocking out the power grid for weeks across Europe or North America. No heating, no refrigeration, no light, frozen pipes, silence in cities once roaring with sound. Your phone dies, your car won't start, supply chains grind to a halt, supermarkets empty, medicine runs out, bodies pile up not from violence but from exposure and isolation. And people would remember how to burn furniture, how to make a stew from dry beans and bitter roots, how to melt snow with a pan and a tea candle, how to tell stories by firelight so children wouldn't scream when the dark returned. In this imagined future, some neighborhoods become like the villages of old, bound by fire and silence. They post guards, they ration heat, they bury the dead in garages or under piles of snow. And when the cold stretches on, when January becomes March and the frost never fades, they begin to do what people have always done. They invent rituals. Someone paints an eye on the door for luck. Another carves protective signs in the floor. An elder remembers a story from their grandmother about hanging dried rosemary in windows. Someone ties a red ribbon around their wrist. They aren't religious acts. They are survival spells. Because when faced with extinction, people don't stop believing. They believe harder. They believe louder. They invent gods if they must. And when no gods come, they light a fire and make a god of the smoke. And still, somehow, people endure. With cracked hands and hollow eyes, they drag themselves into another year. They teach their children how to recognize hoarfrost on the windows, how to boil roots, how to sleep close together without smothering. They pass down the most sacred knowledge of all, how to keep going when it would be easier to freeze, how to wait for a spring that may never arrive, how to love each other even when your skin is numb and your breath turns white. Spring arrived late the year they buried their neighbors in the wine cellar. No birds came to the trees. The rivers didn't thaw. The air still bit the skin like a hungry dog, and the wind felt older than language. But someone claimed to hear dripping, a single drop of meltwater falling from the roof. Then, another. Someone else saw a blackbird moving in the ashburn trees beyond the frozen paddock. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something close to remembering what hope used to feel like. They came out slowly, as if they no longer trusted the light. Their feet were unsure on ground that wasn't packed ice. Children squinted at the sun like it was a stranger. Men and women wept at the sight of puddles. One person dropped to their knees at the sight of a worm squirming in thawed soil and cried like they'd seen God. This wasn't spring as celebration. It was spring as survival, and survival had changed them. No songs were sung, no dances, just quiet, a kind of reverence for having made it through, though no one could explain what through even meant anymore. Some had kept journals. Some had drawn in the soot with fingers. One woman carved notches into the handle of a wooden spoon for every day she'd gone without speaking. She stopped counting after 62, and still she spoke only a few words a week. The land had not simply frozen them. It had reshaped them. Their skin was papery and pale, their breath still shallow, as if afraid to be too loud. They had new superstitions, grown like mold in the cracks of winter, red cloths over doorways, stones stacked in groups of 7, certain words, no longer spoken, especially the names of those who had disappeared in the deepest part of the season. There was one phrase they all began to use when describing those who didn't return. They didn't say, "he died," or "she froze." They said, "winter took them," as if the cold was no longer just weather. It was a presence, a collector of names and breath and memory. They didn't speak of the dead in the past tense. They whispered, in case winter was still listening. Stories emerged over the years, from the survivors and their children. Distorted, filtered, strange. Some claimed the forest around their village had changed, that paths no longer went where they used to. One girl said she could hear voices echoing under the snow even in summer. A boy refused to eat meat unless it had been frozen first. Another family refused to light fires after sundown, insisting that the flames invited something back. No one knew what something meant. They had no word for it, but the fear was real. You could smell it in the way they looked at smoke. A traveling monk came through one summer and found a hamlet full of people who lived in silence, who had no names for each other, only gestures. They welcomed him kindly but watched him sleep at night. When he left, they gave him no gifts, no bread, only a piece of ice wrapped in wool. He never returned. And across Europe, long after these winters passed, the stories remained. of those who became cold even in warm seasons, who felt safest in the snow, who built shrines from the bones, of the lost, who prayed not for light or warmth but for the snow to be gentle. This wasn't fear anymore. It was a kind of transformation. They hadn't just survived winter, they had become winter. In modern times, we speak of resilience as a virtue. We study the ways people endure hardship with plans and skills and technology. But the people of the coldest centuries didn't endure in the way we think. They didn't triumph. They didn't overcome. They simply adapted. They redefined normal. They turned horror into custom. They made ritual out of desperation and built belief out of fear. They learned to live not despite the dark, but within it. Their minds shifted and they passed those shifts to their children. Fear became folklore. Silence became tradition. Cold became holy. And so we find ourselves in a strange mirror, looking back at them while living in a world that still flirts with catastrophe. What if the next blackout isn't just a story? What if the snow falls again and doesn't stop? Will we find our own relics to bless? Will we learn to listen to the walls again? Will we scrape names into spoons and burn goats to keep the sun from vanishing? Or will we, like they once did, disappear into the drift, quietly, collectively, until all that's left is one house with smoke on the roof and no footprints in the yard? Will someone walk into the room centuries from now, see a bowl of melted snow beside a long-burned candle, and wonder what we believed in, what we were afraid of, what we became? Because survival is never just about tools and firewood. It is about transformation. And those who survived the years when the snow didn't melt, they didn't return to the world unchanged. They carried the cold inside them, passed it on in lullabies and nursery fears, taught their descendants how to fold clothes tight, how to listen for wood creaking in ways that meant danger, how to sleep with one eye open in case something knocked at the window when all should be still. They lived, but they never warmed again. The story doesn't end with survival. It ends with what survival does to you. And sometimes, the true winter never leaves at all. OUTRO, ashes in the snow. The fires burned low. The stories ended not with triumph, but with silence. No hymns, no horns, just the sound of wind drifting across abandoned fields and snowdrifts that buried everything but memory. The people of the medieval winter didn't ask to be remembered. They left behind no marble monuments, no victory, songs carved into cathedral walls. They simply endured quietly, completely, and somehow that endurance became their legacy. Winter for them was never just a season. It was a reckoning. It stripped everything down to truth. No lies could survive it. No pride, no wealth. When the snow came, it came for kings and beggars alike. It left only what could withstand silence and cold. Fire, instinct, and fear. And in that fear, something sacred lived. They believed in things we call superstition. They whispered to spirits and made bargains with forests. They bled into their rituals and clung to relics not for faith, but for hope. Hope that spring would return. Hope that the dead would stay buried. Hope that they would be remembered. Centuries have passed, yet we still carry their panic. We talk of climate collapse and blackouts, food shortages and failed harvests. We scroll news headlines about the grid going down or storms that darken half a nation. And deep beneath the surface, we ask the same questions they once carved into their walls with frostbitten fingers. Will we survive this? What will it take? And what will it change in us? We heat our homes and fill our shelves. We have light at the flick of a switch. But the fear hasn't left. It's changed. Shape. It wears new faces, inflation, supply chains, global unrest. But it lives in the same chamber of the heart that once feared frostbite in the lungs and wolves beyond the fence. We don't burn goats in the snow or bless candles in silence. Not often, but we do hoard. We prepare. We build bunkers. We panic buy. We watch apocalyptic films late at night and think, what would I do? That instinct, it's not new. It's old, ancient. It's the legacy of those who survived the cold by never truly letting go of it. Their stories, scattered and half-lost, are still with us. In fairy tales that begin in winter, in old phrases about lean months and hungry winds, in the hush that falls over a room when snow begins to fall unexpectedly, and everyone, for just a second, stares out the window and feels something older stirring. We are not so far from them. We sleep in warmth, but dream of frost. We know we are safe, but check the lock twice when the night feels too still. We pretend we have conquered winter, but deep down we know the truth. We only survived it just like they did. They built no monuments. They told no tales, but their bones whispered in the ice. We were here, we endured, and we feared the cold too.